for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man. And he protected John. When Herod heard John, he was greatly perplexed, and yet liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he solemnly swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you even half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She replied, the head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved. Yet out of regard for his oaths and for his guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This is one of those stories where they say, well, we're going to have to work a little hard to find the good news. A righteous and holy man ends up with his head cut off, all to save face for those who are in power. It's the kind of thing that happens in all ages and all times, where those most vulnerable are willing to be sacrificed on the whims of those in power. But for the followers of Jesus, the beheading of John is a cautionary tale. It's a cautionary tale because this comes only immediately following of the few verses where Jesus sends out the disciples to go and to heal and share the good news of the coming kingdom of God. And immediately as they do, Herod hears about it. When the disciples come back to talk to Jesus on the other side of this horrific tale, they will share stories about God's grace in the most unexpected places. They will tell about stories of healing and sharing and hospitality for people who they had never seen before. But this story, jammed right in the middle of this, is a reminder to all of us that following Jesus will most likely cost us something. But this is not just a cautionary tale because of John, it's also a cautionary tale because of Herod. Herod has something for which we need to learn. But in order to grasp why the head of John the Baptist arrives on a platter, we need to unpack a few things in this text so that we have a clear understanding of what's going on. Now, you all know that Mark's Gospel is the shortest of all the four Gospels. Whenever John tells a story about Jesus' life and ministry, it's always short. He's short on flourish. But there is one exception, and that one exception is John the Baptist. Mark decides to tell this story of John the Baptist with such length that it puts the other Gospels to shame. Because John plays an important role in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark does not begin with the birth stories. There's no star. There's no wise men. There's no shepherds. There's no announcement to a mother or to a teenage girl that she's going to become the mother of God. None of that is in there. The Gospel of Mark begins with John the Baptist. The original Gospel, the very first one written, begins with John the Baptist, which reminds us that we need to know a good bit about John. And the book begins with John calling people to the River Jordan to come and to be baptized and to turn their lives. Repentance was his call. But John was not the first person to call people to the River Jordan. You see, it turns out that other preachers, other folks, had called people down to the River Jordan. And that was always a troublesome thing. Why? Because each one of them were calling them out to cross the Jordan and to come back to reenact Joshua's entrance into the land of the Israelites. And so every time one of these preachers would call people out to the wilderness, the people would begin to have dreams of regime change. That maybe this time the religious leaders who had taken advantage of the poor for their own benefit, for the political leaders, the Rome, that they hoped that maybe this time they would be the ones to overcome. There are stories of folks believing they were going to overthrow Rome after crossing the Jordan without any weapons. And all of them ended the same way, with death, but not success. Messiah had not come. But unlike others, John was not pointing to himself. He was not claiming to be Messiah like others had. And he was not calling for a violent revolution, at least on our side. God will take care of those things, John would say. John's call was reminding folks to be prepared for the one who is to come. And that meant we had to do life differently. He said, when people came out, well, now what do we do? He said, well, if you have 2 coats, give one away. Simple stuff. He said that if you have more than you need, you should give it to somebody else. And if you were in a position to take advantage of other people, don't do it. The tax collectors, the soldiers, don't extort people. Live as honestly as you can, and in a corrupt world, that's about as revolutionary sometimes as you can be. But John's call to the Jordan was not just politically challenging. It was not just about religious change, it was also another challenge to the religious leadership. Because over time, the religious leadership had developed a highly detailed system of religious piety. If you wanted to get right with God, you had to pay up. You better have some money. No one could find ritual purity without participating in this system of economic sacrifice. You had to buy something or present something out of your rich abundance, which meant most of the 99.9% back then didn't have anything to share, so they would bring pigeons, and even that would cost them. But that was the only way they had been told that they could get their sins forgiven. And along comes this wilderness preacher who said, it doesn't cost you anything economically, but it will cost you something otherwise. You've got to change your life. Just simply going through the motions wouldn't be enough. Living differently is what the call was about. And that was why John was dangerous, because he was going outside the economic structures. And the religious leadership had done quite well for themselves. One thing we know, when you start to mess with the economic income, or when you mess with the income stream of the powerful, you will be in trouble. We don't know why, but John is locked up in prison, and guess what? The religious leadership don't say anything, not a word. They probably are glad he's there. Their silence speaks volumes. So by the time we hear this flashback story, we need to keep in mind that the beheading was really just only a matter of time. At some point, John's end was coming because he just couldn't be that righteous. And the other thing is, we know that the people were moved by John. The people understood authenticity. People were hungry for that. You can't imagine we live in a time where we were hungry for authenticity on a grand scale. So Herodias is really the only one, is not the only one who would rejoice at the death of this wilderness preacher. She only gets blamed. The ancient historian Josephus writes that King Herod is the one who beheaded John, but he says that it's because John had become too popular with the people. Now, I want to say something about Josephus for just a moment. You need to know that he was not a disinterested party. He at one time had been a zealot. Some of you know about the story of U.S.A, where the Jewish rebellion went on top of this mount and stayed there for a long time. And instead of surrendering, they chose death. But that meant that one person had to be the one who was going to kill themselves. And when they finally broke into the Sodom, what they found was every person was dead. But this was not the first time this sort of lot casting happened. It happened another time in the Galilee region. And it turns out the person who cast lots upon, who was supposed to kill himself before the Romans came in, turns out to be Josephus. He didn't kill himself. And then he spent the rest of his life, on some level, trying to persuade the Romans to keep him alive and to keep some cover for his own people. So as we know, no historian is disinterested, but we always have to keep something in mind when listening to the historian Josephus. But Josephus says very clearly that this didn't have anything to do with Herodias. It didn't have anything to do with some party. What Josephus said is that John was really popular with the people. And that meant that he was a rival to the king. And whether he liked him or not, John had to die. So that the people knew that there weren't to get any notions that things might change. Take away hope, and the population will simply give up. What Mark tells us, though, is that Herod was both enthralled and repulsed by the wilderness preacher. Now, Herod historically was quite a figure. He was Jewish by birth, but we know that he only practiced his faith when it was convenient and when it served his political ends. In fact, the title of king really is kind of dubious. He had to go to Rome and lobby for it because he really didn't have a kingdom. He was just sort of a guy who made sure that things kept in order. It's clear that they were not happy with the request, and the truth is Herod was not as powerful as we might think. He was at the will of the people. He had to rely on those gathered in that place on that day. If he lost respect in their eyes, it was no small matter. It could have cost him his life and even his kingdom. Now, lo and behold, we find out that Herod's married his wife, and John didn't like that. The reason John didn't like that is because Herod's brother was still alive and still married to his wife. Did you catch that? Yeah, so this is why John was pointing out, this is a problem. You can't do that and be faithful in this. There was no certificate of divorce here, so this is now a problem. So that means Herodias, the daughter, is not in fact his daughter, but his stepdaughter. And that changes the tone of that gathering. Now what we know is that Herod was eventually exiled to Gaul. But not before the Roman army had to come and bail him out, because it turns out when you cast off your first wife and your father-in-law or former father-in-law has quite an army, you can get in trouble. And lo and behold, Rome came and bailed him out and replaced him, and he spent the rest of his life in Gaul. So what we know is in this event that we have a king who allows his ego and his fascination with his niece and stepdaughter leads to the execution of John. And what we learn in that powerful moment, for the powerful, that saving face is more important than the lives of the poor. When Herod hears about Jesus' work, he is certain that John the Baptist has returned from the dead. I like to think of that line as Herod being a bit terrified. He is a person who lived in two worlds, fascinated by the faith that John professed, but also a political figure who understood a different world. And here he was stuck between the two. And maybe this was just a moment where he got a glimpse that the power that John talked about was in fact real. And that probably haunted his dreams. Herod knew, Mark tells us, that John was a righteous and holy man. And unlike other religious figures that Herod knew, he was not in the business of lining his own pockets. John was not using his moral power for anything other than to invite people to live as faithfully as they could before God. And that is what can get us in trouble, apparently. The lasting cautionary tale for us really is twofold. The first is clear. Following Jesus can be costly. This is not an accident that this story ends up right here. That this flashback comes when Jesus' popularity is growing and the disciples are excited about the amazing things that are going on. To remind us that it cost John his head and that the cross lays before Jesus. And most, if not all, of the early disciples, we are told, come to an early and martyrdom death. The tales of martyrdom in our faith are legendary. However, for most of us in our own time, we will not face this sort of life challenge. We will not, most of us, come, I would imagine, to a martyr's death. Which is why I'm convinced that we might just have a little bit more to learn from Herod than we do from John. You see, Herod was on some level a believer, but only when it was convenient. The message of the good news of God fascinated him. And it challenged him. But what it didn't do was transform him on any level. But when his interest in faith required more than he could give, Herod was unwilling to respond. All of us live lives where compromise is required. We are not called to wear camel's hair. We are not called to eat locusts. John does not call people out in the wilderness to imitate him. He calls them out to the wilderness to go back to their places of where they live and then live as faithfully as they can. And their response is, how? And he starts them simply. You got more than you need? Give it to those who don't. He doesn't say you have to wear camel's hair. He just said give some of that stuff away and live honestly and faithfully. The challenges we most often face are the ones that cause us to choose saving face over the lives of the most vulnerable. Or maybe in our own time, convenience over the lives of the most vulnerable. Or tax cuts over the lives of the most vulnerable. The truth of the matter is, what if Herod had made another choice on that day? It would have cost him. It would have cost him to stand up to Herodias. We don't know what would have been the end of the story, but either way, Herod's end came dead. The question is how we will live in the midst of that. But the truth is, for him to stand up to Herodias, to look at his guests and go, this is ridiculous. I'm not doing this charade. It would not have cost him his life. And that is the enduring struggle and challenge for the privileged faithful of our time. We have to be willing to lose face in order to be faithful. The truth is, I don't know where the places in each one of our lives, your lives, are that requires us to struggle around this. But you know that. And some days they're different than others. The good news is, when we fall down, we're invited to try again, ask for forgiveness, and look for new ways to be faithful. There are times each day, I'm sure for some, where we're called to act differently, where we're called to raise our voice, to say no to the death around us. And in doing so, we might cause some tension, we might cause some trouble when we choose to speak out. But following Jesus means we're required to stand up for the most vulnerable, for those in prison, the poor, the widow, and the orphan. After all, John's in jail. John's in prison. And he becomes a pawn in a dinner for the powerful. The guilt of Herod, though, isn't enough. And that's really the issue, right? The story comes out with Herod hearing about what's going on, and he remembers and believes that this has now come back. You've got to No, I believe that Herod had to have felt guilty. And what did that guilt solve or serve? Not one thing. Guilt is not enough for the journey of faith. When we don't speak up, when we have turned away, we're not called to feel guilty and then move on. We're called to admit, ask forgiveness knowing that it's already given, and then figure out a way to act in the future, to speak in the future, to put feet to our prayers and hopes for justice. Because justice will not come for the most vulnerable if we are just feeling guilty. And that is the cautionary tale for us from this passage each day of our lives. Amen.